So on Tuesday morning, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was on breakfast television doing a sort of year-in-review interview, talking about what they've accomplished, what they plan to do, how they're going to help regular Canadians, pretty boilerplate stuff. But one of the questions from the interviewer to the Prime Minister really hammered home a crucial issue: that Justin Trudeau doesn't really understand what middle class is, or he refuses to define it, or he doesn't know how to define it. The question basically asked him, you've spent a lot of time talking about the middle class, talking about how you want to help the middle class, talking about how the middle class is essential to a just and prosperous democracy, and on and on and on. So can you help me in defining middle class? And all Justin Trudeau could say was, Canadians know who's middle class, and implying that Canadians know who isn't middle class. But what you can see here again is something pretty crucial. The middle class has been maybe the central messaging point for this Liberal government, going all the way back to the 2015 election, even further than that if you want to talk about Justin Trudeau's rise to power. There's maybe nothing the Liberals have talked about more in these past 4 or 5 years than the middle class, how they're trying to help it, how they're trying to champion it. And yet they cannot define it. And the reason they can't define it isn't because it's too complicated, or it isn't because Justin Trudeau is stupid, or it isn't because his government, hasn't put the time and effort to figure out exactly what it means. The reason is that it's not politically beneficial for Justin Trudeau and his party to actually define the term middle class, because the term is more of a political tool than it has any sort of measurable value to understand the class makeup of Canadian society. At the end of the day, many Canadians see themselves as middle class, and that could be based on the type of work you do, that could be based on where you live, that could be based on how much money you make, that could be based on your level of education. Often, it's a combination of a whole bunch of factors. But the point is, middle class in countries like Canada and the United States basically apply to everyone who is neither rich nor poor. If you're not very poor or very rich, you're likely lumped into this large, nebulous middle class definition. And the Liberals feel that's of benefit to them, because if 80, 90, maybe 95% of the population can be on some metric included within that middle class definition, then the Liberals can say, well, gee, all of our plans are for the 95% of the population, or 90 or 85 or whatever you want to call it, percent of the population that's middle class. So, we're helping everyone who makes from $30,000 a year to $190,000 a year, or $150,000 a year, or whatever you want to, set the caps at specifically. And so we're the government helping regular people. But the problem with that is that it actually hides the real substantive differences between Canadians. There's big differences in incomes and life experiences and challenges between somebody who is quote unquote lower middle class and somebody who is just below the barrier of what we would call wealthy. And Justin Trudeau has often used that confusion from the term middle class to put forward policies that help well-off people, but cast in language that seem to be helping everyone. So if we go back to 2015, Justin Trudeau promised a middle-class tax cut. That tax cut did not benefit 75% of Canadians. The lowest 75% of Canadians did not see a single cent of benefit from that tax cut. That largely went to the top 25%. Now, it didn't go to the very, very wealthiest. It wasn't a tax cut for them, but it was a tax cut for the above average family. Now, you might define middle class as 80% of the population, in which case some of those people who got the tax cut might be middle class. But if you were to say define middle class as the middle third of the population, aka the lowest third being lower class or working class, the middle third being middle class, and the upper third being upper class, well then not one single middle class person benefited, because again, the bottom 75% didn't benefit. which would include all of the first 33, the second full 33, and then even some of the top 33 would not be included. And even if you say, well, middle class is half the population and, the top and bottom 25 are upper class, or middle class is 75% of the population, the point is there's no coherent definition. There's none. In academia, we have specific sociological and historical definitions to help us understand classes. The capitalist class, the working class, the middle class. But in political terms, the middle class term is meaningless, and it's largely used by the liberals to undercut true progressive politics. You see it even here. Their liberals with their 2019 tax cut are classifying it as one that benefits the middle class. And again, while the benefits don't go to the very wealthiest, they actually accrue most among individuals that make above average incomes, right? Like, it still is a benefit to people who make in the mid 100,000s a year in terms of salary. And again, it needs to be understood that there are entire families all over this country that don't even make half that and would be understood as middle class. A family that makes $80,000 a year, on a 2-income family, say averaging about $40,000 a year, would be deemed middle class. And yet so is one person that makes $150,000 a year on their own, let alone what their spouse may or may not contribute as an additional income. So we see the issue here. The term has no real value. The term is propaganda. It is historical and contemporary propaganda that benefits people who want to preserve the social and political and economic and cultural status quo. Because the reality is the vast majority of people are working class people. In sociological and historical terms, pretty much everyone was working class except for the capitalist class and the actual middle class, lawyers, doctors, professors, those sorts of people. But that was only, a few percent of the population. There was about 90% of the people that toiled for their living, a few percent of people that controlled the economy in the interests of exploiting those working people, and a small middle class segment that didn't really fit the understandings of either, but were nonetheless important actors in society. Again, doctors, lawyers, clergymen, academics, people like that. But in our own understanding, we try to use middle class applying to almost everyone to basically paint away class distinctions. Rich people love this. Rich people love this a lot. In some cases, it allows them to pretend they're middle class and therefore not the problem. I've seen some rich people making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year say they're just regular middle class folks like everybody else, when that couldn't be further from the truth under any sort of rational definition. But because it has no real definition, we just sort of allow it. Because, we allow people to self-identify into the middle class, and therefore they're regular people, and therefore policies need to cater to them just as much as policies need to cater to the person who makes $40,000 a year. And we can see how this term is pure political propaganda by Justin Trudeau's Minister for Middle Class Prosperity, Mona Fortier. Again, I've talked about how ridiculous this position is before on this YouTube channel. I have a video dedicated to it. But the whole point is that minister cannot define what middle class is. Her job is to represent the middle class as they try to find greater prosperity and opportunity and security in this country. So you would think that to represent a group, you would need to be able to define them. And the minister hasn't been able to do that. The mandate letter she was given, the prime minister gives mandate letters to all of his cabinet ministers about what he expects them to achieve over the government. Nowhere in there is a clear, coherent definition of middle class. All she could say was, well, it's about being able to play hockey, or it's about being able to have some disposable income. And I get what she's saying there is, well, if you're really, really poor, you're not middle class. But that means that maybe the vast majority of Canadians could find themselves within the definition of middle class. And that's not helpful at all. It's much more helpful, I feel, that the NDP has a critic role for inequality and affordability, because that allows us to strike at the core, to recognize the systematic inequalities in our society and how they affect the most marginalized people struggling to afford a better life. That is much more clear. That is much more coherent than the Liberals' championing of this nebulous middle class. So again, when you hear Justin Trudeau talk about the middle class, don't just think about it as a political buzzword. It is that, but it's more insidious than that. It's an attempt to distort. It's an attempt to paint over. It's an attempt to remove essential details and wrinkles and realities about what Canadian society has been, is, and can be if we better understand it.